Hey guys, the W here. Are you looking for a fun tank build to do veteran and hard mode content with? Then this video might be for you. And please feel free to subscribe so you don't miss out on further content just like this. Let's buff up and we're going to get into the statistics. So first things first, we have 36 points into health and 28 into stamina. You can wiggle this around depending on your liking, but as you can see, we're sitting at basically 28k stam, 38k health, and just under 21k max mag. As for recoveries, we've got 1.3k mag recovery, we've got 775 stamina recovery, and 670 health recovery. As you could see before, let me just buff up again. We have 30k resistances on physical and spell. If you want higher, you can get higher. These stats are just what I'm using, so you can adjust this to your liking a little bit. As for the Mundus, I'm personally using the tower. However, the one thing I would recommend is switching this out for the Atronach for the extra sustain. Personally, I'm happy with the sustain on this build myself, but if you're struggling with that, please swap it out for the Atronach, which gives you magical recovery. Alright, so one thing to note, we are Imperial. I'm just going to quickly go over the passives for this. So the first one, you just get extra experience and you gain extra gold. Isn't that important, but it's just there. We have Tough, which increases our max health by 2000, which is just nice to have. Imperial Metal, which increases our maximum stamina by 2000, which is also huge to have, as stamina is our main resource for blocking. We then have Red Diamond, which is the main reason why I've picked Imperial for this, which reduces the cost of all our abilities by 6%. One thing to keep in mind, you can switch this up if you're more comfortable with using a Nord or various other classes, and yeah, but personally I've gone for Imperial. Alright, so let's talk about food and potion options. So personally, I'm using Longfin. This is just rawly because it's cheaper to make and, you know, cheaper is good, right? However, I will say if you have access to sugar skulls, I would use sugar skulls. They're just better overall, but this is the budget food option, and obviously you can use crown food if you have any of those lurking around. Moving on to potions, we are using tri-stat potions. They restore health, magicka, and stamina, and give you the recoveries for each. So these are a must-have in my opinion, especially for like the heals and just overall sustain is just really good. I'm going to show you the gear sets I'm using first because otherwise the skills will not make any sense. So first things first, we're using Elemental Catalyst. This is from Stone Garden, and what Elemental Catalyst does is whenever you apply shock, frost, or flame damage to an enemy, it applies a debuff to them for 3 seconds, which can stack up to 3 times because of the 3 elements being applied, and it increases the damage that they take from critical damage by 5% for each stack. So at 3 stacks, they will take 15% extra critical damage, and this can be applied in an AoE. Now, we are double barring this because the one thing with Elemental Catalyst is if you only have it on one bar and you swap to the bar that it's not on, you will lose the procs, so you do have to double bar this. Now, on the front bar, we are using Defending, and I have a Flame Damage enchant, but I would recommend swapping this out for Exorb Stam or even Exorb Magicka. It will just help you with Sustain. Now, onto the shield, we're using Reinforce with a Max Stam glyph. You can swap out the Max Stam for something of your liking. Maybe you want to try a tri-stat one there. So you can adjust this as you like. Onto the back bar, we're using Infused, and we have a Crusher enchant on there. Personally, I just think Crusher is the best enchant, and I will use this on all of my tank builds, so that is something to keep in mind. Now, onto the body pieces, I'm going to show you the monster set first. So we're using Archdruid, and we've got one piece heavy, one piece medium. The medium one's there just for the extra passives. And what this does is whenever you heavy attack, it does shock damage in an AoE, and it applies major vulnerability for 7 seconds to those enemies hit, increasing the damage that they take by 10%, and this can happen once every 15 seconds. So every 15 seconds when you heavy attack, you're applying this debuff, and it's just a really nice buff for the group. So make sure that you keep this up. It gives you a bit of pen, which isn't that relevant. But onto the enchants, and we're using max stam here with sturdy. Yet again, if you want to switch things out for maybe tri-stat, then you can. This is just what I'm using personally. Onto the second set, we are using Lucent Echoes Perfected. Now, if you can't get the perfected version, then feel free to get the non-perfected. And this set is a trial set, obviously, so you get the 3-piece bonus, which reduces your damage taken by 5%, which is just nice when you're in dungeons, trials, and arenas. That 5% damage mitigation is just good. You get a bit of healing taken and some stats. And the 5-piece bonus here, while you have more than 50% health, the critical damage and critical healing of any group member not wearing this set within 28 meters is increased by 11%. If you have under 50% health, your damage taken from monsters is reduced by 20%. Like, that is a huge thing to have, and it means if you are in a bit of a pickle in a dungeon where you're low health and you're just struggling a little bit, this does help you out with that 20% damage reduction. But the main reason we're using it is because critical damage and critical healing by 11% means that those crits are going to be doing so much. And obviously it's stacking with this, which means there's a lot of crit damage there, and then 10% extra damage on top of that, so they're going to be taking a lot of damage and even more when things crit. But let's just talk about the enchants and what we're using. So on the chest I'm using reinforced just to bring up the armor value of the piece, and we're using a multi-effect enchant, aka tri-stat enchant. Onto the shoulder, we are using medium, so I've put this in reinforced just to get the resistance of it up a little bit, and we've got max stam on that. Onto the waist, we have sturdy with max health, just to give a little bit of health. As I say, all these pieces you can change out for different glyphs if you want to mess around with the stats a little bit to your liking, but we're using sturdy here, which is basically reducing the cost of block. And the rest of the pieces here, we have 2 in reinforced and we have 2 in sturdy, and as you can see, we're using kind of a mixture of glyphs here. So feel free to edit this to your liking. But the main thing here is we're using reinforced to get our resistances up a little bit, and then we're using sturdy as the other option to reduce our block cost. Now, the one thing that I will say is if you don't need the extra resistances and you're happy with tanking with even less than this, then you can put sturdy on everything and it will just reduce the cost. Now, we're using obviously elemental catalyst on the jewelry, and we've got mag recovery in all of these. We've got 2 harmony as well as 1 infuse. Infuse will just increase the overall recovery that you get from it, and then harmony is basically whenever you take a synergy you get extra resources. So this is what I'm using personally, but feel free, as I say, to mess around with the glyphs if you want extra resources, or even if you just want extra sturdy pieces, etc. The one thing I'm going to say as well is you will notice that I'm using sturdy and a lot of max stam. And the one thing is with this tank is the way that I tank personally is I have high max resources, and then I reduce the cost of block, which means I can block for a long time without having to use potions and use other things because of the reduction in cost and having the high pool of stamina. However, the one thing I will mention is I know a lot of people and friends that I have that play this game which tank in a slightly different way, where they will have lower max resources but high recoveries. And I just want to say you can do this with this build, of course. So if you're not using sturdy, like use divines and use reinforced and use the atronach for recovery, so it will boost that up. And then use a food like jewels of Misrule, and you'll be good to go. I just wanted to mention that because this build, I don't want it to be like a lot of builds that I see online, which is like set in stone, use this, use that. If you want to change the monster set, change the monster set. If you want to change this, change this. Like, anything here in regards to like enchants and stuff, change your like and make it work for you. The one thing I will say though is this build is catered to elemental catalyst, so just keep that in mind. Right. So now that I've talked about the gear that we're using, I'm gonna get right into the skills. So first things first, I'm gonna talk about subclassing. So we're using Storm Calling from Salt Line. We're going to take Ardent Flame from Dragonite, and we're taking Winter's Embrace from Walden. Now, I'm going to go over a few options of skills as well because there is a few things, especially on the back bar, that can change depending on whether we're fighting trash packs or whether we're fighting a boss. But there's some that will stay regardless. So, first things first, we're using Boundless Storm. This is from Storm's Calling, and this is our resistance buff. So, this is giving us major resolve, increasing our physical and spell resistance. And the main reason we're using this is because it buffs our resistance, but also it applies shock damage every 2 seconds. And that shock damage lasts for 30 seconds. So every 2 seconds for 30 seconds, it's going to be doing shock damage, which will proc one part of our catalyst. Now, another thing that's really, really nice with this is you get Major Expedition, which increases your movement speed by 30% for 4 seconds. So this tank gets about, and you'll see in the thumbnail, this is a really fast tank to get around with, and you will go from Adpool to Adpool really quick and stay ahead of everyone really easily. So, on to the next skill, we're using Spell Symmetry. Now, I know this is a very niche skill and not a lot of people use this, but I think this skill is great, especially with the concept of this tank. So, what it does is you basically are trading health for Magicka, and don't get me wrong, can be risky in fights, so you're gonna have to get used to using this. But you're getting Magicka back, and you get quite a large sum of Magicka back. And the second part of this is whenever you use it, your next Magicka ability is reduced by 33%. And that means if you proc this, you can then use quite a lot of the skills afterwards to then, be a lot cheaper. And I'll get onto this a little bit more when we look at some of the other skills. So the next skill we're using is Pierce Armor, and this is just your generic taunt. However, it also gives major and minor breach. So this is a huge thing to do. If you're in a boss fight, you're going to be using this on the boss as much as you can. Well, when I say as much as you can, whenever you need to retaunt, um, you want to make sure that you're using this for the debuff. And this is just, as I say, your generic taunt. You're going to be taking the big ads and ad pulls with this and make sure that they're debuffed and taunting the boss. On to the next, we're using Streak. Now, Streak is just a really nice skill to get about with, and I use this on this because not only does it do shock damage, but it's just fun to use, let's be honest. And this is where I wanted to talk about spell symmetry as well. As you can see, it reduces the cost of an ability by 33%, and it also gives you Magicka back. And as you can see here, casting again within 4 seconds, sorry, costs 33% more. But this reduces something by 33%, which means this will cost whatever it costs regularly at all times, as long as you use this first. So yeah, and you're also going to be regaining 3k stamina, which is just under the cost of this, which means you can spam Streak to get around very, very quickly between trash packs. So that is why I use this. And spell symmetry works with other things. So like the one thing I will say is spell symmetry, don't be scared to use this if you do feel like you need the resources back and you have the health to be able to do it, but obviously just be careful. But yeah, Streak, amazing, and also it stuns enemies for 3 seconds, which means once you've pulled everything in, if you do streak through things on, like, say you're trying to get away to the next ad pool, you can basically stun them in place, which will basically be similar to an immobilize. Now, on our front bar, we're using Polar Winds. Now, this is our self heal. and it also heals a second player, and it's also a heal over time. So you get an initial burst, which mine heals for 12k, and that can obviously crit. And when it crits, like, yeah, you will know about it. Like, it will heal a lot. And you're getting 3.3k every 2 seconds for 10 seconds, which means you're just getting passive healing all the time. And the fact that you're getting that 3k health every 2 seconds, you should just keep this up at all times if you can. And obviously, you can use spell symmetry before casting it. And although, don't get me wrong, the healing done is reduced, so I wouldn't recommend doing it all the time. But if you really, really need to get a heal out quick and you don't have the resources, and obviously spell symmetry, you can do that before that for emergency. But overall, just use Polar Wind. But try and keep it up. It's just free healing over time, and you also healing an ally. So if you see an ally getting like hit by mechs or AoEs or whatever, and they need a heal quick, and your healer's not able to like get there quick enough, then or even if the healer's down, like it's just a heal for them as well. We are using shield discipline. Now, the one thing I will say, the reason why I personally have this on is because sometimes it allows me to get reses on people, and what it does is it basically just is like an automatic block of all attacks for 8 seconds, and it's really cheap, which means you will have it pretty much all the time. And it's like if you need to res someone and you're the last one up, this can save you. However, the one thing that I will say is if you don't want this as like a utility thing, put on barrier. Barrier is generally a better option overall, but I just use this just because, if I'm in a random dungeon and someone dies and like the whole group is wiped except for me, I might be able to pick someone up while I'm using this. So just keep that in mind. Now, moving on to the back bar, we are using Engulfing Flames. Now, we're using this primarily for the fact that it applies a dot which does fire damage, and it applies it in an AoE. So, this is the second part of Catalyst. This is the flame damage part, and you can just use this on ad pools and bosses to keep that up. So what you want to be doing is you want to keep up Boundless Storm, you want to keep up Engulfing Flame, and then I will also say this as well right now is you want to keep up Blockade of Frost, which you'll be doing anyway. So this is your frost damage, this is your fire damage, and this is your shock damage, which means you have 100% up times on all three elements, which means that's how you're getting your 3 stacks of Catalyst. Now, Engulfing Flames has a secondary effect, which it basically all flame damage against that target is increased by 6%, which means it's also buffing the flame damage of your teammates. So this is always nice. Now, the second skill that I'm using here is one that I would swap out during boss fights, especially. But for ad pools, this skill is so amazing. It's basically an AoE pool. However, it only has an 8 meter range, so this is why you can see I actually have a second pool ability. But during an ad pool, what I usually tend to do is I run in, I taunt the main stuff. If there's a bunch of little ads around, I will proc this. After 2 seconds, it pulls everything in, it heals, and it's applying minor breach to those little enemies that are getting pulled in. And it's AoE, so it will pull in all the enemies in that ad pool, as long as they're within 8 meters of you. Now, next is in a range. This is going to be your range taunt, and there's also a synergy involved, which if your ally is targeting that enemy, that they can activate it and it will deal flame damage to that enemy as well as the enemies around them. So that's just a nice thing to keep in mind. But yeah, this is generally just used as it's a range taunt, so you can taunt things that are far away and just keep more control of the ads. Next, we have Blockade of Frost. This will basically be what will be proccing or frost damage for Elemental Catalyst, and you want to keep this down at all times. And it also plays Minor Breach and reduces their movement speed by 40% when they are chilled. And another thing to also just keep in mind is whenever you cast this, you and nearby allies basically are getting a damage shield that absorbs projectile damage specifically. So not regular hits, but projectiles, so fireballs like arrows, etc. and this can be used to great like extent, especially in certain places. Like for example, Rock Grove on the Titan boss, you can actually spam this, and a lot of healers will be spamming this because all those projectiles from the Titans like pretty much get negated because there's so much damage shield being provided to the group. Onto last skill, we're using Unrelenting Grip. This is another pull ability, but this is the long range single target pull. This is an AoE short distance pull, so we actually use both. So this will be used to pull in those ads that are too far away, that are like at the back of the group or in a corner, etc. And this does Major Expedition as well, so you're getting extra speed for 4 seconds, as well as restoring 100% of the ability if you can't pull something in, which is huge. It basically means, say you're on a boss fight, you need to get somewhere and you're on your back bar, you can actually just hit the boss with this, get your Major Expedition, and it's free because you can't pull a boss. So it's always nice. And the fact that it just gives back 100% if you can't pull something, it means you're not wasting resources if you accidentally click on the wrong enemy. Now, the last thing that we're using Aggressive Warhorn. Ignore the fact that mine isn't leveled up. I only just unlocked the wolf on this because I used to use something else when subclassing wasn't a thing. But Warhorn, you use this and it gives max resources by 10% for 30 seconds. But the main reason you're using this is because your group will get major force, increasing critical damage by 20% for 7 seconds, which is just really, really nice. That 7 seconds, though, I will say will go up. It's just mine's only level 1, so just keep that in mind. But those are the skills that we're using. Now, I'm just going to quickly talk about some of these skills. So, on the back bar, as I say, we've got 2 pulls. Now, if you're in a boss fight, you don't really need 2 pulls. Like, you might not even need a pull at all. But the one thing that I will say is, generally speaking, I keep Unrelenting Grip on anyway, just because I can basically proc Major Expedition whenever I want. So that's just something I keep on. But I would 100% recommend on boss fights swapping out Leech and Burst, or whichever variant of this that you have. There's a few options that you can put in there. Now, you've got things like gripping shards if you need to immobilize enemies around the boss. However, probably wouldn't say that's the best option. There is options in here that you can use. Like in some situations, you might want to put weakness to elements, like so you can put a debuff on like targets away if there's mechanics that require it. As well as that, you have some other options here which I would also highly recommend. So I have healing contingency. There is other like variants that you can put on this, but this is a really nice skill to have because basically you use the skill, and once you use the skill after it, it procs and it applies whatever effects you have on it. Personally, I have reduced damage taken by 8% for 8 seconds and minor intellect and endurance, which gives recovery. And personally, I have a heal on it at the moment. However, the one thing I will say is the damage shield version of this is actually really, really nice. So that is something I would also recommend. Another thing as well that you can put on is Blood Water. Personally, I don't tend to put this on that often. However, it is a great option. This is the unmorphed version, obviously, but you know, I personally wouldn't necessarily run it when you've got spell symmetry on the front bar because you're then double stacking things that cost health. However, it is a really good option. Um, Other than that, if you do decide that you need extra healing, you can also put on Vigor on your back bar. If you just want like a little group AoE heal. So that's also something to keep in mind. And then obviously for your front bar, as I said, you can run Barrier. Personally, I don't have this unlocked at the moment, and I also don't mind using the shield one just to be able to get reses anyway. But that's just something to keep in mind. Alright, let's go over some passives. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because some of them aren't that important, but we'll start off with Stormcalling. The main ones here are going to be Capacitor and Expert Mage. Expert Mage is increasing your weapon and spell damage for each sorcerer ability you have slotted, which is just passive, so that's nice to have. Amplitude and Energize, I'm just gonna like hover over so you can read them. They're basically just damage ones though, so they're not that important. But the main one here is Capacitor, which is just giving you flat resource recovery, which is just nice to have for anything. Moving on to Ardent Flame. So the first one, Combustion, we're mainly taking for the second part of the passive, which basically whenever you're applying Burning, which is anything that applies fire, you restore Magicka and Stamina every 3 seconds, so this is just more sustain on top of what you have. Warmth isn't that important, just damage and snare, so I'm going to just go over that one. We've got Searing Heat, which another one that we take for the second part of the passive, which is that increase in duration of 4% for Fiery Breath, which is just nice to have for the extra duration so we don't have to reapply it as often. World of Ruin, another one not that important, just damage. Moving on to Winter's Embrace. Most of the ones here are pretty useful. So the first one, Glacial Presence, is basically increasing your chance to apply chilled, which means you're going to be proccing brittle more often, and it increases the damage, which isn't that important, but it's still nice to have. Frozen Armor, for each Winter's Embrace ability you have slotted, you get increased resistances, which is just nice to have passively as we have that heal on our front bar, so we get the extra resistances. Icy Aura is basically a passive that whenever you're getting hit, you're applying stacks to the enemy at 5 stacks. The ad that's attacking you will get Major Maim for 3 seconds, reducing the damage by 10%, which is just nice to have. It will apply on bosses and ads all around you, so it's just reduced damage. And then Piercing Cold, we're mainly taking this for the first part of the passive, which is increasing the amount you can block by 8%, and then obviously it increases your damage with Frost, which is just a nice passive as well. Moving on, we then go on to One Hand and Shield. We're taking all of them here. So the first one, just reduce the cost of your abilities, which means your taunt will cost a lot less. We then have the second one, which increases your weapon spell damage by 5% and the amount of damage you can block by 20, which is just nice. We've got Deadly Bash, which basically, long story short, will allow you to bash at cheaper cost, which means interrupts will be cheaper. Deflect Bolts means that we're going to be taking less damage from projectiles, which are any range attacks. So we also have the last one, which basically reduces the movement speed while you're bracing. So when you're holding down block, you'll move quicker. Next, I'm just going to go over Destruction Staff. So, Destruction Staff, the first passive, personally, I'm not taking. A lot of this build is Magicka based, and the fact that I'm blocking with Magicka on my back bar instead of Stamina can sometimes be an issue because I run out of mag a bit quickly in some situations. So, personally, I don't use this. However, if you feel like your sustain is going to be easier for you with this, then please put it on. Penetrating magic, not really that important. It's just ignoring resistance. Elemental Force is a nice one because it increases your chance to apply status effects by 100%, which is just nice. We've got Ancient Knowledge, which whenever you're using an Ice Staff, in this case, you are reducing the cost of block, and also the amount of damage you block is also going to be increased, which means you can just get hit harder and take less damage. Destruction Expert isn't really that relevant on tank, but whenever you kill an enemy, you basically are restoring Magicka. But yeah, again, as I say, this isn't really that important other than the second part, which when you absorb damage using the destruction skill, like as in, say, you use the Ice Staff's wall and you get the shield, then you can get Magicka. But this isn't that relevant. But yet again, it's just nice for passive sustain. Now, moving on, we don't take anything in light. Medium, we take Windwalker, so we reduce the cost of your stamina abilities, and it gives you a bit of extra recovery. There is a few things here as well, like athletics. Unfortunately, I have not leveled this enough, but I would definitely pick up athletics. And then agility is also another passive one that's not bad to have. So yeah. And then taking all the heavy passives, I'm not going to go over this too much, but it's basically giving you a lot of resistances and health, and also a little bit of like recovery and stuff. So I will just hover over those so you can see. Moving on, Fighters Guild we're not using, so we don't take that. Mages Guild, we're going to be taking these passives, which reduce the cost and increase the duration, as well as increase your max mag and recovery by 2% for each slotted, which is just passive, so that's nice to have. Undaunted, we take both, which the first one basically you're going to restore more when you take his energy, and the second one will give you max stats for each type of armor you equip. So we have one medium, so we get the 4% on this rather than 2. So I'm just going to go over champion points. I'll start with the green tree as there's not much to talk about here. The main ones that I would recommend getting is Rationer because it increases the duration of your food and drink. Liquid efficiency because it basically gives you a 10% chance not to consume a potion. And then I'd recommend Steed's Blessing, so basically whenever you're out of combat you move 20% faster, and those are the main ones that I talk about. I wouldn't really worry about anything else too much other than maybe like Breakfall, but it's not really that relevant. Um, and then I guess, this one's not too bad either, because whenever you resurrect yourself or someone else, you won't consume a soul gem. But hopefully, you shouldn't be dying too much. Now, onto the blue tree. I'm just going to go over this. So, we've got Ironclad, which basically reduces your damage by 6% at total. This is for direct damage. We have Enduring Resolve, which again 6% damage reduction for damage over times, aka dots. We then have Duelist Rebuff, which is another 6% damage reduction, but this is for single target attacks. And Unassailable, which reduces area of effect damage by 6%. Now, the one thing that I will say is this one can be swapped out for something like Bulwark, which will give you a bit extra resistances. If you do want to capture resistances, that is what I'd recommend doing. And then I do just have a couple of other ones unlocked, not that they're really that relevant, so just ignore these ones. And one thing to say as well is obviously make sure that you're picking up the passives in here for the extra damage resistance, and just, yeah, any of the passives, just pick them up. Now, moving on to the red tree. So personally, I'm using Brazen Anchor, which gives you 20% block mitigation, but obviously decreases your speed. This, in my opinion, really doesn't matter in this tank because you have so many ways to get major expedition or even just streak around. So personally, I really don't mind running this on here. And then I'm using Rejuvenation for a bit of extra sustain, Fortified, which just increases our resistances, and then Boundless Vitality. As I say, you can mess around with the stats, so if you really want, you could actually put more points into your health and have a bit less stam, for example. And then you could put on something else, like maybe Expert Evasion, so you get free dodge roll every so often, or just, Celerity for extra movement speed, just to counter that Brazen Anchor even more. Um, or, even Soothing Shields or On God, like just stuff like that. But yeah, it's up to you. But this is what I'm personally using. Yeah, guys, that is the build, and thank you guys all for watching. Feel free to drop a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.